what's really interesting about fashion is that you can't see it without talking about the context, which is bringing across where we are as a society and as a culture in that particular moment.
What do you think is the future of these craft communities?
I think there's so much design talent in India. They're all really coming to the forefront with a very strong ethos and a very strong understanding of being a very proudly made in India DNA. Of course, these cluster communities bring in the creativity, but can these young designers bring in the commerce and the marketing and the know-how and the social media?
Do you still feel writing is a strong way of communicating, our story internationally?
Of course, I think writing will always be, right? Like it'll always go down in the books, right? But again, we're going back to is it well-researched, well thought out, nuanced writing? Or is it because you feel you need to take a contrary POV? Is this the first time we've seen a Kolhapuri-inspired shoe on international runways? No.
Yeah.
Is this the first time that we've stood up and said, hey, listen, this is not cool? Yes.
Welcome to Season 4, Episode 11 of the IKKIVI Podcast. Today we sit down with Priyanka Khanna, author, art, design, fashion writer and speaker based in Mumbai. After starting her career at Hearst Magazines in New York, she worked at Vogue India as features director for over 15 years. She played a pivotal role in shaping how we see and how we perceive and how we interact with the Indian fashion industry. Today, she's a contributing editor at the World of Interiors and The Nod, the author of the novel All the Right People, and is currently working on her second book. We talk about India today and the blend of tradition and modernity, placing fashion and design with various cultural contexts. Priyanka shares with us her journey into the fashion industry, her writing career, and also gives us advice for aspiring creatives. Together, we explore the evolution of Indian fashion, the balance between cultural appropriation and appreciation, and the responsibility of storytellers in changing and shaping the narratives in a rapidly changing mediascape. Hi, Priyanka. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to have a conversation with you, especially because you've had such an influential and powerful voice in the fashion industry in India. And of course, everybody's talking about India and the fashion industry today. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts and, kind of where you see us headed as the fashion industry from India.
Thank you so much. You're so kind. And I'm excited to be here and talk about something that has been such an integral part of both my life as well as my career for over a decade now. So yes.
So my first question to you is about your writing. You've written across formats from fashion features to the All the Right People. What draws you to a particular topic? I know it's kind of different now that you've written you have been writing fashion and you have fiction as well. Can you tell us what your thinking is and what your thought process is when you're choosing a particular topic to write about?
So you're right. I started my career focusing on fashion and fashion features. I was the fashion features director at Vogue India for many years. And that's actually where my interest lies. But I think what's really interesting about fashion is that you can't see it without talking about the context, which is bringing across where we are as a society and as a culture in that particular moment. You cannot discount the influences of art, architecture, history, sociological changes, cultural changes, the stability of the economy of a particular country. There are so many different aspects that sort of come in when you're talking about fashion and talking about a fashion movement or a trend. They're also closely interlinked. So while I have, my title might have been at Vogue Fashion Features Director, and I might have, focused on fashion, I actually was writing on a variety of things through a fashion lens. And that's something that I've taken through my career. I decided a few years ago that I didn't sort of want to be boxed in to a particular role. And I didn't want to look at my career only in sort of a linear way. I wanted to really expand it to talk about different aspects, and fiction for me has always been a love. I've been a big reader from the time I was a young girl, and my dream was always to write a book. And again, my book, when I was writing it, has focused on contemporary India and changing relationships within contemporary India, especially relationships between three young girls and friends who are the three protagonists of the novel. And it's really they're sort of coming, I don't want to say coming of age, but they're coming into their own as they navigate life and careers and love and family and a changing country too. Again, it goes back into my whole ethos and there is of course lots of fashion and fun in it, because that's how I describe the characters, is through what they're wearing. But again, it's again rooted back into the changes that are happening culturally. So I think, to go back to your question, what draws me to a story is really, where are we at that moment? And, what am I saying about where we are as a culture at that moment? And of course, when I'm talking about it, I'm talking mostly about urban India. I'm talking about things that are happening in cities like Bombay and Delhi and Bangalore. What are the trends? What are the movements? What is drawing people towards them? And again, trends not only in terms of fashion trends, but cultural trends, sociological trends. So, for example, in the last few years, I've been focusing on expanding. So I now write on art. I write a lot more on design, along with fashion-focused stories, as well as cultural trend stories, along with my fiction too.
I love that. I mean, something that I'm extremely passionate about is contemporary India and how we've kind of evolved over these years into this beautiful amalgamation of tradition and craft and cultural values, but also so modern in the way that we think. And I just love that beauty. And that's kind of where what we do at IKKIVI as well, is that bringing of together of India and this modern world. So I definitely want to talk about where you see us currently as a country. But before we get into that, can we talk a little bit about your fashion industry experience and how you kind of chose to get into the fashion industry? Is it something that you've always wanted to do, or was that something that kind of chanced upon you?
So, I grew up in Bombay, and then I went to university in New York, in upstate New York. And for a long time, fashion was very much a part of my life, simply because my father was a garment exporter. We understood sort of what the cycles were and the trends were and the trade shows he was showing at. And, we understood what it meant to be a manufacturer in India. And for the longest time, that was what India has been the manufacturer to the world, not necessarily getting the due in terms of our craft and our design. And my father sold pieces that the pieces that he made without, of course, any label, were sold in really prestigious department stores like Gallery Lafayette and a lot of incredible outlets all over Europe. So we saw it from the beginning. My sister went into design. She's a young. She has a very cool label called Priyanka Khanna. So I think it's sort of been a part of how we've seen part of our life from the time we were growing up, basically, because that was dinner table conversation sort of in our home. And our mom has always had, a very strong aesthetic and a point of view. So I think, of course, that does influence us. I was always I have no design sensibility, unfortunately. My sister has all that, all those skills. But I've always loved to write, and words have always been really important to me. And I've always loved to read. I've been writing since I was 16 years old. So I knew I wanted to get into the media space at some point, and magazines were my first love. Like books. When I traveled abroad, I would come back with stacks of magazines. I used to go to the Raddiwala here because they were the only people who had international magazines when I was growing up. It's something that was always very important to me. And I had the opportunity to work at Hearst Magazines in New York for a couple of years post-graduation, which was an incredible experience, was the peak of magazine culture. And when I moved back to India, Vogue India was launching. So it sort of felt that, the timing was right, and it's where I wanted to be. And I was lucky at Vogue because I had a great editor, Priyanka Khanna, who was, such a champion of younger talent and really putting her team out there.
Yeah.
So I was very, really, really fortunate. And I think for me, what was really interesting was being able to see, to talk about fashion through the lens, talk about the fashion, but also apply different perspectives to it, because I've
Mm-hmm.
always had an interest in, like I said, design and culture. And, I love movies. I love to read. I love to go see a young artist or a show at a museum. And to talk about fashion in that context has always been really exciting to me. So I
Yeah.
think, this was where I was sort of meant to be and where I was to start my career. And now I'm even more excited because I'm trying to tell stories in new ways, which I think is very easily done in the digital age we live in today. We can apply
Yeah.
ourselves and talk about things not in a cookie cutter format anymore. And I think there's so many young new voices coming out, which to me is very exciting.
Yeah, for sure. How do you see it kind of, again, going back to the fashion industry specifically, but how have you seen that evolved over the years, right from when you had just started off at Vogue India to where we are today?
So, when we started at Vogue India, it was very interesting because India was still sort of a very nascent luxury economy
Mm.
in terms of luxury international brands. Luxury has always been a part of our lives, right? Whether it's in, the gold jewelry we buy, or the craftsmanship, or how everything is handmade, or even our saris with real gold zari that have been passed down through generations, or the lives of, the royals. Luxury has not been new in the Indian lexicon. Of course, the definition of what luxury is has changed. But I think what was interesting at that part was Vogue India was sort of educational. It was
Mm.
informing the reader of, what set apart one fashion house and from another fashion house. We were telling the stories of their legacy, what they brought to the table, giving them the history of some of the world's most famous brands. And by the time I left, the reader totally knew who she was. She was not
Mm.
looking at us to guide or Vogue to guide her. She knew who she was. She knew what she liked. She'd evolved from the first stage of luxury buying to having her own unique sense of style. But so she looked to Vogue more for stories of how it's rooted in culture, how it's rooted in legacy, how they were rooted in trends. Also for of course, up to dates of like what was out in the market.
Mm-hmm.
But she was applying that to her own life in new and very novel ways. So I think
Yeah.
that was to see that transition was really exciting, to be sort of part of that movement. And I think we were very lucky. We were at the right time in magazine culture. Of course, now it's a very different beast, and I feel very
Yeah.
sad about that. But at that point, it was a really exciting moment to be there, to know that your sort of words mattered, that people actually were reading. The magazine from cover to cover, that all your effort sort of was put in.
Yeah. In today's world, though, now, what do you feel like? For me as well, growing up, magazines were a very important part of learning.
Yeah.
It was my exposure to a lot of things as well. And for most of people, 10 years ago, 20 years ago,
Yes.
what do you think is important in today's day and age in terms of influence, in terms of representing or kind of educating the youth or people in today's day and age? Because we have so many different kinds of media right now, and we don't have that one platform. Who do you think holds that kind of baton where, in terms of educating and creating awareness and influencing today's, people?
I think it's anyone who has an authentic voice. I think ultimately, unfortunately, what's happened in a lot of cases is the corporatization, and it has become a business, and there has become sort of a race for numbers, which really changes and erases your authenticity, right?
Mm.
And while I understand, of course, creativity and commerce go hand in hand, I think for me, what I'm looking for is whether it's in a publication or whether it's in a voice online, or whether, for me, what's influential is that authentic voice. Do I
Mhm.
really trust you? Do I really trust what you're saying? Can I make sure that it's not been sponsored in a particular way that, it's not ringing true to me or ringing true to you. So if it doesn't ring true to you, it's not going to ring true to me. So I think having that authentic voice, and that's something honestly I struggle with too. Like I have I like to use my social media platform to post things that are of interest to me, and so I find myself often saying no more than I say yes to collaborations because I want to be authentic. I believe in micro influencing. I believe in the power of micro influencing. So if there is a certain number of people following me, it may not be in massive numbers, but if there are a certain number of people following me, can they trust what I'm putting up? Is that something that I'm really vouching for? So I really do try to do that. I really do try to be as authentic I can in my own small way, in an ecosystem which of course is rapidly changing. So how can I be authentic to myself, and how can I be authentic to the people, the community that I have, had, and who I have sort of built, where they know that what I'm my name on or endorsing is something that is true to my life and true to my sort of values in a way.
Yeah. There's so much content out there. We have a lot of young designers, creative individuals listening into this podcast, including writers as well. Do you have any suggestions or advice on how people can? I mean, of course, authenticity is something that's really important, but standing out is extremely hard. And there is no linear path anymore. Like, you don't get into the publications anymore and have jobs at publications and kind of grow from there. But it's like you have this huge platform that you can be present in.
Yeah.
But like, what makes you different? How do you stand out? Do you have any advice for young?
So, I got the best advice I got when I was writing my book was write what you know. And, there are two sides to that. Of course, a lot of writers find that limiting because why would you only, writing is an act of imagination. So you should, write, let your imagination sort of bound free and write everything, while others feel like, okay, you can write from your personal experiences. I feel that in a way also rings true for having sort of a social platform, is put out messaging that that you're comfortable with. Again, it goes back to the authenticity conversation, right? Like, is this your area of expertise, or are you just sort of jumping in without really knowing it because it's clickbait, because it's something that will get you views and reels? Again, not to limit yourself. I'm not saying, only talk about what you know, but have you, if you want to, you feel you have a voice to add to the sort of the fray about something that's trending. Have you done your research enough that you can speak on it with authority? Have you spoken to others in the field so you can get different perspectives? I've always been of the school of thought to say, to be the first one to say, look, I don't really know much about it. I don't think I'm going to weigh in. And I also believe in the adage that every opinion you have does not necessarily need to be shared online. It really doesn't. Yeah. And I think you can do that without being inauthentic or not true to yourself. I think, there are things I don't know enough about, and I'm not sort of embarrassed to admit it. Is this something I need to go into deeper? Maybe it's, something like maybe it's a political situation that I'm not seeing the nuances, or I don't know enough. And can I look into it further before commenting or before sharing that article? Do I really need to share it because everybody else has sort of shared it, which is where we are at this point, right? There have been moments when I've wanted to give my opinion on something and I'm like, listen, let me just think about it for a moment before like clicking. It's so easy to just press click. Yeah. Do I really have something new to add to the conversation? I think that's the differentiator, right? Do I have really something new and something that is honest to add to that conversation? Or am I just jumping onto the bandwagon because I feel that's where I should be?
I think it's the numbers that kind of is leading the steps that we're taking, or leading us in some way, instead of our own inner feelings or our own path. And I feel like understanding that and differentiating that, however hard it is, how do you see that happening? Do you do that consciously, or is it something that kind of has been a part of who you are?
I totally agree. And, listen, I have only respect for content creators. I think it's the hardest job in the world. One of the hardest jobs in this world. Sorry, I would.
Yeah.
I have complete respect for content creators. It is a difficult job. It's not easy. And I think, the fact is that you are being judged by the metrics, and which is very difficult, to live in day in and day out, especially if that is sort of how you are, that is your livelihood,
Mm-hmm.
And I think, it's difficult because I had brands approach me and they're like, can you share your numbers? Can you share your insights? And I often wonder, like, if this was going to be my full-time job,
Mm.
how much of a tussle would that be between what I want to put out there and what's actually trending? I think this
Yeah.
is a conversation every content creator is constantly having within themselves, as well. I'm sure there's a massive disconnect. And again, like I said earlier, of course, creativity and commerce go hand in hand. Unfortunately, in an ideal world, it wouldn't happen, but let's be realistic, it does. So I think that is the issue. I think if you're not going to change the system where you're like, okay, listen, I like this person's voice. I think they have an interesting point of view. Yes, maybe it will not get XYZ reach, but it's important for that person in their own sort of micro influence and in their own micro community be a part of what I want to say. And a brand doesn't
Mm.
approach it like that. I think this is constantly going to be a battle every person on social faces between
Yeah.
what they want to do and what they're expected to do. And it's funny, it goes back because that was actually one of the starting points of my fictional novel, All the Right People, was this disconnect, especially for young women in India, between what they want to do and what they're expected to do.
Mm.
You know?
Let's talk about that a little bit. I find that interesting as well. I feel like this is the generation that's kind of it's a very interesting generation, and it's a very interesting time that we're in, where we're fighting the previous generation's thought process of certain expectations that were set on them and that they kind of lived by, especially women, right? Like women were meant to stay at home, take care of their families, children, all of that. But we're fighting that in this generation where we're working women nowadays. To the next generation, where it's like this other extreme that we've kind of seen both sides of things. What are your thoughts on it? And how do you see it kind
So,
of
when
playing
I
out?
started writing my book, it was very, and of course, my book is set in a very urban, privileged India. It isn't representative of experiences around the country because, like I always say, India is like many countries in one. But I think the whole idea was that there is this constant disconnect. These were young women who have access to everything, who've gone abroad to study, and who've come back home and are expected to live within certain diktats of family and society. And how do they sort of navigate their way through it? It's very easy to
Mm,
say rebel and stand up for what's right, but stand up for what you feel, which you should in many situations. But I think for me, the gray area lies in this constant navigation. How can we stay true to who we are and also live within our familial systems,
mm,
and our social systems? And I think what's interesting is that the next generation is, we are not a digitally native generation. I'm not, at least, and I think that disconnect is quite apparent. And I think also every generation says, back in our day, like I find myself saying this all the time, and I'm
yeah.
like, oh God, I'm sounding like my parents. Like, back in our day, things were not like this. Bombay never used to be like this,
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and personally, I'm fascinated by my father's stories of Bombay, which is,
Yeah.
going to be a book one day for me. And it's influenced a lot of my writing on Bombay. But I think, I find myself saying to my kids, back in our day, we didn't have iPads and we lived just fine,
Yeah.
all the time, including like up to 5 minutes ago, we were having arguments. So, yeah, I think, of course, there is going to be a very different approach just because this generation has not known life before
Mm.
online. They didn't have modems and startup and VSNL codes and MTNL codes and like, that pinging sound of like
Yeah.
finally connected to the internet and, sending emails
Yeah.
because, instant messaging was also came out so much later, and, ICQ status updates, and you didn't know what everyone was doing every minute of the day. And you were wondering like, what were your friends up to? What was that guy you were crushing on? What was he
Yeah.
doing? And it's very different, but I also feel there's a level of disconnection, right? Like I've been talking about this a lot with friends recently. Of course, I have a lot of friends who are online and social, and I have a lot of friends who are not at all. They don't have a social media presence. They may come online to check their news, but a lot of them, whether they've gone off or they won't share anything. And I often feel like our connections are also becoming a lot more superficial because you know what someone is doing by what they've posted, but do you really
Mm,
know what's going on in someone's life? And I'm finding that more and more. We have no idea what's going on in
yeah.
people's lives. So I feel like that lack of disconnection, I'm already beginning to feel as a part of a generation that is not digitally native. I wonder what's going to happen to the next generation.
Yeah.
So you might be building this community online, and community is the buzzword. What is your community online? Which basically means, let's be honest, it's a whitewashing of, not whitewashing, sort of, it's a washing away of like, what is your following, right? Like,
Yeah.
but where is that sense of connection? You might have that community, but where is that sense of connection where you don't necessarily know what's happening in people's worlds and people's lives, and you're not really sitting down and having that conversation because you feel like, hey, I know, she was here, or she just got this promotion because she posted online, or her kid just got into this great college, or all the sort of highlight reels of people's
Yeah.
lives, but you don't really know their true lived experiences.
I wonder if that comes with age in general, because I feel like I've interacted with a few like 18-year-olds recently,
Yeah.
and there is no. I feel like it's just so surface level. There's like nothing more to it. But I also feel like, is that a teenager? And at least that's the hope that I'm
Yeah.
living on. Like,
That's
hopefully,
that's a
yeah,
hope, because I find myself, I mean, I'm in my 40s, and I find myself saying, listen, I need to make more of an effort to call, some of my friends to see how they're doing. I can't be just relying on
yeah,
what I'm seeing online to see that they're okay. And I'm sure vice versa, maybe they're feeling that, about me.
yeah,
So, I think that, of course, that does come with age too. You get busy and caught up in work and family, and, parents who are growing older, and, sort of other commitments.
yeah,
But I just wonder how, it's something I've been thinking about, is like, how is that connection going to change by the time my kids are older?
yeah. That's a scary thought.
It is a really scary thought. Like, how are they going to sort of connect on a deeper level with people?
Yeah, yeah,
And it's no judgment. It's just because this is the only way they've known.
yeah,
They've only, my 5-year-old knows how to, navigate devices better than I do.
yeah.
But he's never really sat and seen me flip through a magazine anymore, because that doesn't exist. I mean, we read. I make sure I read, as you can see from my bookshelf. I make sure I read physical books because I like the experience. So they're aware of that. But
Yeah,
we get a few newspapers at home. But it's not like we grew up Sunday mornings. My dad is at
yeah,
the table reading the newspaper, and
yeah,
that's all changed because we're on our phones. Reading
yeah,
whatever up to date breaking news is happening at that moment.
yeah. In fact, I've seen my daughter, 3-year-old, walking around with a phone, and I was talking on the phone as well, sitting at the dining table, and she was on the sofa on the phone. This was last evening,
Yeah.
and actually she had a toy phone in her hand, but she was just talking. I said, "What is it?" And then she's like, "Headphones, headphones." I'm talking to. I was like, 3-year-old.
Love that. I love that, right? Like they mimic what they see, and they see
Yeah,
us constantly. It's like I have to catch myself all the
yeah.
time, being like,
It's
okay, I
hard.
really can't be policing their iPad use when I'm on my phone,
I know. Yeah.
all the time. But I keep trying to
Yeah.
explain to them, I'm like, this is work too.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for listening to the IKKIVI podcast. If you're enjoying our episodes, consider supporting us by visiting www.ikkivi.com. That's IKKIVI.com. Since 2015, IKKIVI has been thoughtfully curating modern fashion infused with Indian heritage, bringing you hand-picked pieces that blend tradition with contemporary elegance. Our passionate venture celebrates the vibrancy of contemporary design while preserving India's rich craftsmanship, creating stunning and ethical silhouettes you'll love. Our podcast is another passion project driven by our dedication to sharing meaningful stories. It is self-funded and will always be free to listen to. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for being here. Now let's get back to the episode. So going back to a little bit about the Indian culture and where we stand, as well as the fashion space that we're in, fashion has long been seen as a cultural barometer. And in today's landscape, what do you think kind of has And influence in terms of, does writing play a strong enough role in today's day and age in terms of communicating the Indian cultural story that we've had? Considering that it has so many layers to it and we've been through so much over the years, do you still feel writing is a strong way of communicating, our story internationally, globally?
Of course, I think writing will always be, right? Like it'll always go down in the books, right? But again, we're going back to like, is it well researched, well thought out, nuanced writing? Or is
Yeah.
it because you feel you need to take a contrary POV just because, now, sort of everything becomes dynamic, topic, everything becomes something to pick on, right? Like,
Yeah.
unfortunately, I don't want to use the word pick on, but everything becomes a dynamic topic, and contrarian points of view do tend to do well, unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
online. So how much have you really researched it? How nuanced is your argument? Can you see both sides? I also think the writing brings about the action, and it's also the craft. I think, in the last few years in India, what we've really seen is the recognition of us moving away from that manufacturing hub, which is what I only knew growing up, right? To design and
Mm-hmm.
craft getting a spotlight. And I think it's been baby steps and it's been a long time coming. But I think, what brands like Dior, who have that influence, have done in India, where they've recognized artists, artisans, craftsmanship. They've recognized the India sort of true skill, and a skill that is necessarily that needs support. I think that
Mm-hmm.
has been really crucial. And my hope is that that momentum can constantly be built, right? That
Yeah.
we can build on that as a country internally, that we don't only need the West to sort of recognize that. And I think a lot of designers are doing incredible work now. I think a lot of them have had great success in their work sort of being recognized in a way that's not diluted from who they are. And I
Mm-hmm.
just hope that momentum sort of continues. So I
Yeah.
think, of course, to go back to your question, writing does play an important role, but I also think writing that moves to action plays the most important role. And that can only, again, happen if it's really well researched, well thought out, and situated in the cultural context of what our country is. We're such a
Mm-hmm.
dynamic country. There's so many. I always say, it's very easy for someone to come to India and think, okay, this is Indian, let me reinterpret it in its own way. But is it really being true, right? Because there's so many different aspects of India,
Yeah.
bringing that across. And I think the localization, and I think that's one thing that Priya really succeeded and did at Vogue, was making it a really strong local voice and giving it as much flavor and representation. Could we all have done better? Of course. There were parts of India we did not reach, and we did not have that sort of time to reach. But I think in the 14 years that I was there, we really did try to do our best to grow that representation as much as we could. And
Yeah.
while knowing that there are certain things in India that do well, that are sort of a flavor in every home, whether it's films or cricket, or there are certain things that most Indian homes have that passion for. So how do you balance that within telling newer stories?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In I feel like specifically in the fashion industry, of course, like you said, India has always been this hub where there's so much. I mean, international designers have always, come to India for so many different things, whether it's the embroidery or block printing or mirror work or anything of that sort. We've always had that. We've been rich with all of that, and
Yeah.
we're I mean, as a culture, willing to share that with the world as well. But recently, with the Kolhapuri slippers that we've seen, what is the? I mean, I find it very confusing because I do feel like, I mean, I'm not going to share my opinion, but where do you feel that, what is the line between appreciation and appropriation? And in terms of, because, okay, yeah, what is your opinion on that?
So it's a gray area, because again, we're very quick. And again, I'm not talking about the Kolhapuri thing. I think they needed to do their research better. I think they needed to give credit where it was due. I do think that, but I also think we're really quick to label things.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this goes back to the whole idea of instant and clickbait,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think there is a really strong line between it. And I think, words like appropriation are now sort of tossed about so easily,
So
right?
easily.
So easily. Is this the first time we've seen a Kolhapuri inspired shoe on international runways? No.
Yeah.
First time that we've stood up and said, hey, listen, this is not cool? Yes, probably, yes, right? And of course, it's great, artisans should be recognized, and it is a much needed moment in our culture. Are there also going to be Indians who go by that Kolhapuri? Of course, yes, right? So, what do we have to say for that? The memes have been
Yeah.
abounding on that aspect too, right? So I think, again, it just really goes back to research. So many of the people, and I didn't actually weigh in on this online, which maybe I should have, but went back, was so quick to repost that and the outcry, right? But have you really looked into the Kolhapuri? Have you really
Yeah.
looked into how it was made? Have you really looked into the fact that there are very few skilled artisans left in Kolhapur who are making the original shoe? Because in India itself, iterations of that shoe are seen on every street corner. And we call
Yeah.
it Kolhapuri without even
Yeah.
blinking an eye, right? It's become sort of like a homogenized term for a certain kind of sandal. But it's
Yeah.
not really a Kolhapuri.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
say this knowing my father, who, I've come home and said, oh, my, see these now silver metallic Kolhapuris. And he's like, no, this is not a Kolhapuri. He used to get his Kolhapuris from
Kolhapur.
Kolhapur. And, he's worn them for years, and, they are oiled so that they last longer, and, all of that. And so we are all sort of all guilty in our own ways. Of course, not at a scale that Prada has done it, but it has been sort of, I don't want to say appropriated, but it has been reinterpreted in his own way with local talent as well, right?
Yeah.
Of course, this is by no means am I discounting the fact that the credit needs to be given where it's due. But I also think a lot of the commentators who sort of jumped onto the bandwagon really did not stop to think about
Yeah.
how what really the state is of the skill and the
Yeah.
craftsmen, who many of whom have not necessarily taken it through the next generations because there has been a lack of demand
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
particular kind.
I feel like we've seen this across multiple kinds of crafts and techniques as well across the country, right? What do you see? I mean, and we work with a lot of independent designers that are championing these crafts and techniques using, going to these cluster communities, working with them in terms of fabrics or techniques or prints or whatever it is. But what do you think is the future of these craft communities that have, like, I mean, quite honestly, it's like art is almost dying, right? By not giving them the demand that they need to sustain and survive through these years. What do you think is the future of this?
I actually want to I think, optimistically, having seen this from the time I started at Vogue to now, and I'll be very honest, I'm embarrassed to admit when I first started, I didn't have that much understanding. And I feel I'm still constantly learning about the different kinds of works and techniques. And, it's such a, I love meeting people who have sort of studied textile design, who have researched this, whether they work in museums or, they're writing books and, sort of textile historians. I love learning more about this because I feel there's so much, the length and depth and breadth of what is on offer, what we can offer as a country is incredible. But I think, I think the fact is that the fact that conversations are happening, I feel like the fact that younger designers are coming to the table, looking for new craft clusters that they can support, looking at bringing new and fresh eyes to traditions that may need updating to be more accessible for larger audiences. I think that's what's really exciting. And I think, again, we're at a really interesting moment because I do see that growing. I think there's so much design talent in India. And I think, they're all really coming to the forefront with a very strong ethos and a
Yeah.
very strong understanding of being a very proudly made in India DNA, which
Yeah.
is incredible, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's such an amazing moment to be a part of this industry. I just hope that, and this is something I've said always, I hope that they can be sustained. Like, I hope that their businesses can be sustained so that they in turn can support the communities that they um, have focused on, because
Yeah.
that's ultimately what it comes down to, right? Like, of course, these cluster communities bring in the creativity, but can these young designers bring in the commerce and the marketing and the know-how and the social media? And it's not easy being a designer today, because I think it's there's so much at play here.
Yeah.
They bring all that in to keep that going, and I really do hope ultimately it lies in with the end consumer, which is you and me, and um,
Yeah.
someone who's walking into a store and say, you know what, I'm not into this fast fashion.
Yeah.
I want to buy something that actually has meaning and that will
A
last,
story.
and a story that I can, like, previous generations have passed down. Saris
Yeah.
have come down through so many generations, right? Beautiful heirloom saris and beautiful pieces. How can these pieces also be part of my next generation's wardrobes? How can I wear this multiple times rather than buying that one throwaway piece from a high fashion label that
Yeah.
doesn't really support anything I value. So again, it goes
Exactly.
back to, finding what's important to you and your values. And then we as consumers are the only ones who really, the designer can do their best. They can put stuff out there. But as consumers, we have to go in and buy that product, before
Yeah.
we yell about international brands not doing their bit. We're the ones who need to do our bit here locally as well.
And actually, we at IKKIVI, we focus our attention on international consumers. So we're marketing internationally.
Yeah.
Primarily, the US market is who we focus on. And the appreciation that we've seen from end consumers about the crafts and techniques, because we're
Yeah.
telling these stories, is so much more than initially when we were in India and telling these stories. It wasn't as appreciated. I think it's because of the understanding already that existed in terms of the ease and the ability to kind of walk down the street and have something, like buy fabric and have it stitched, versus in the United States, for example, they don't have the option to do that. And buying high quality products are so insanely expensive that it's not easy for end consumers to buy. So we've seen that internationally, that consumers are really loving this depth and the story that goes into the making of a product. So I just hope that we're able to kind of, like you said, sustain that, so that it kind of goes down the supply chain and there are a lot more people that are benefiting from it.
That's interesting. I think, that's an interesting point of view. I also feel like, going back, I think what is the biggest struggle with handmade is making sure quality controls checks.
Yeah.
The understanding that each piece is not going to be uniform, and that as an end consumer, we might get something where the color may be slightly different because it is handmade, or a stitch may be a bit different from what we had imagined. And I think, again, that all goes back to knowing that handmade is not going to be the same as machine made.
Yeah.
There is not, and that's the beauty of it, right? Like, that you're not going to be wearing what everyone else is wearing,
Yeah.
cookie cutter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, fast forwarding and kind of to wrap up our conversation, I'd love for you to talk about something that we spoke of right in the beginning about your book and about, this, the idea of this culture that we are in currently in India. I'd love for you to touch upon, kind of where we stand in India, where we're headed as a country, as a culture, from an Indian point of view, but also where we stand globally.
So, again, I want to caveat saying this. Obviously, my perspective is very urban,
Yeah.
and it's set in a very, it's a smaller sort of, I don't know, it's not even a bird's eye view. It's a small view of
Yeah.
what's happening, because I can only talk about what I see around me, right? I
Yeah.
think, we're a dynamic, challenging country in a lot of ways. But what is interesting for me, the stories I want to tell, is the sort of the cultural changes that are happening in India in certain parts of society, right? Where women are sort of coming into their own, are holding their own, are sort of subverting what is expected of them. I'm at that point where, like you, I have children, how sort of women are redefining their roles, whether it's, working along with motherhood or taking career pauses. We've moved on from the girl boss and lean in movement. Where are we at this point right now, right? Where we're sort of examining what is true to our identities, whether we identify as working moms, or whether we identify as professionals, mothers, why can't we, we're sort of like, I feel like we're in this moment where we're trying to just like re-identify ourselves and
Yeah.
maybe not label ourselves at all.
Yeah.
I think what's really interesting about this whole moment that we're in is this whole idea of not sort of being boxed in anymore, right? Like we understand that different seasons and different phases of our life require different things. I started my career at Vogue very much like, okay, this is the path I need to take. I need to
Yeah.
climb up the ladder. I no longer look at it like that. And, for me, that has been the biggest realization that, listen, I can do a bunch of different things. Like, who says I can't write fiction while also writing about fashion and design and, also consulting on different projects? Like, who says I can't do a bunch of different things? They all feed into different interests of mine. No one has only a singular interest, right? And that goes back into why I love writing about fashion primarily, because I can look at it from so many different aspects. So I think that we're at a really interesting time, I think, especially as women. And again, this is a small view, but I think we're really redefining how we want to live our lives, and how we want to see ourselves, we're not so worried about the way society or sort of the world sees us anymore, but how we want to see ourselves and how we want to, live and what we want to pass on in the case of, to the next generation.
Yeah, for sure. And my last question to you is for advice for the young women who are listening into this conversation who want to get into the creative space of the country, whether it's fashion or architecture or design or art or whatever it is. What advice do you have to them?
I think hone your voice. I think that's really important. Like what stays true to you. There are going to be moments where, these are all cyclical trends. Someone will want, if it's in the case of design, there is, there'll be a certain movement and maybe that's not your aesthetic. So don't sort of pander if you can, not. So I think honing your voice is really the way to sort of stand out. And I also think go back into doing the research, research where we're coming from, research what's brought us here, and that again will help you hone your voice, right? Because if you have an understanding of where you were, we are a country with so much legacy. We're not a new country, we have so much history, craftsmanship behind us. How can that be brought back in through your perspective or through your voice? How can you and I think those are the two things that are really important. And I think also reach out to people. I've been amazed in my career at how people have been willing to give advice and how people have been willing to mentor. And there'll be for every no, there'll also be a yes, where someone is to sort of help you along the way and reach out to you if you feel that's something you want to do. And lastly is to pivot. I think that was my biggest lesson to myself, that I could pivot and I could do something differently. I saw my career when I was younger in magazines my whole life, not knowing that, of course, the world would change drastically.
How did you make that decision, though? Sorry, one last question of kind of pivoting. And how did you imagine writing a book?
So, a book was always my dream. My dream was to write it before I turned 30. I was a decade late on that. But, I guess all in good time. I was very scared to write a book, actually, because I had never written fiction before. I'd never written an entire story, of my book closed at 110,000 words. I've always written articles which are 1,000 words, 1,500 words. And often I'm interviewing people. So I'm writing, profiles of them and then their voice, right? Like, how do I keep a story going? So that was always my biggest fear. So that would be my other advice. Don't be scared. Just do it. I wish I had done it earlier. Very honestly, the book is something I knew I needed to do, but I also felt that I had reached a point at Vogue where I had done what I wanted to do. Like, I had been fortunate to have some incredible experiences. I interviewed some of the world's best design talents. I had seen some incredible shows and displays of craftsmanship. I'd done a lot of what I wanted to do. And it was at a moment where I was having my second child and I wanted to sort of pivot in a way where I could also focus on my children while still working. And I have no sort of shame in saying that. I don't want to say the word balance because I don't, I think that keeps changing. But I wanted to have a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I wanted to have time with my kids. I wanted to be able to do work that was still exciting and challenging to me, and
Yeah.
where I was learning and growing. So I think for me, the biggest thing was the growth factor. I wanted to
Mhm.
grow in different ways. Um,
Yeah.
and I felt that wasn't, that this was pushing me out of I had become very comfortable.
Yeah.
It was pushing me out of my comfort zone, which
Yeah.
was, this book really pushed me out of my comfort zone. And the book I'm writing right now is really pushing me even further out of my comfort zone. We don't know where it will end up, but
Yeah.
for me, that's been the biggest thing. If I'm going to spend time away from my children, it has
Yeah.
to be work that's meaningful and that I'm growing from.
Yeah.
And also, listen, that pays the bills. So
Yeah. I love that. I love that. I resonate with that so much because I'm also trying to find that balance. Like you said, it keeps changing
yeah.
literally on a daily basis. But I love that.
And
Thank you
it's
so
okay,
much.
Like there are days like I've never postponed an interview three. I mean, I've never postponed any work thing three times, and I've done that with you, and I apologize. But
I get it.
I haven't, I had my ducks in a row for the last couple of
Yeah.
weeks. So
Yeah. Yeah.
and now hopefully in the next couple of weeks they'll all be lined up. So
Yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Priyanka, for
Thank you.
taking the time. It's been
No,
such
thank
a
you.
pleasure
Thank you.
having you and having this conversation with you and understanding what goes on in your mind as well. It's been such a
Thank you.
pleasure.
Thank you. It was lovely chatting with you.